Hi, and welcome to my channel. Here, you'll discover some of the most incredible events in history. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss anything, leave a like in advance, and enjoy this. November 1918, Germany signed the Armistice of Compiègne, acknowledging defeat. In June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles formalized the terms of surrender. Loss of Alsace and Lorraine, parts of Prussia, and all overseas colonies. Limitation of the army to 100,000 men, with no tanks, heavy artillery, or an air force. Ban on a submarine fleet. Reparations to be paid to the victorious powers. Official acceptance of responsibility for starting the war. These terms caused mass dissatisfaction across the country. Political tensions escalated between moderate parties, left-wing forces, and nationalists demanding revenge. At this time, a man emerged on the German political scene who would become the symbol of the coming dictatorship: Adolf Hitler. Nationalism and anti-Semitic propaganda. In 1913, he moved to Munich. When the First World War broke out the following year, he volunteered for the Bavarian Infantry Regiment. He served on the Western Front, was wounded twice, and was awarded the Iron Cross First and Second Class. In 1918, while recovering in hospital, he learned that Germany had capitulated. He perceived the defeat as a betrayal by politicians and the home front, a belief that would later become a central part of his ideology, known as the stab in the back myth. Focused on rebuilding the party. By the late 1920s, the NSDAP was still a minor political force, but the economic crisis of 1929 dramatically changed the political landscape. Industrial collapse, mass unemployment, and poverty made Nazi rhetoric increasingly attractive. In the 1930 elections, the NSDAP won 107 seats in the Reichstag. By July 22, 1932, that number had risen to 230, making it the largest party. Despite this, Hitler refused to accept the position of chancellor without full control. Following a political crisis and the succession of unstable governments, on January 30, 1933, President Paul Hindenburg faced the immediate risk of military confrontation from the West. In March 1939, Germany violated the terms of the Munich Agreement and fully occupied the Czech lands, creating the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Slovakia was declared independent but remained under effective control of Berlin. This was clear evidence that the policy of concessions could not restrain Hitler. In April, Germany issued an ultimatum to Lithuania, demanding the transfer of the Memel region, and Lithuania complied. Soon afterward, pressure on Poland began, with demands to return Danzig and provide a corridor to East Prussia. Poland refused. Britain and France guaranteed Poland's independence, but had no real plans for immediate military action against Germany. Their strategy remained to delay the conflict and try to avoid a full-scale war. In Moscow, it was understood that Poland alone could not withstand the German onslaught, and there was a clear threat of the USSR finding itself face-to-face with the Wehrmacht without allies. In April 1939, the Soviet Union began negotiations with Britain and France for a military alliance. The talks progressed slowly. The Western powers were reluctant to enter binding agreements with the USSR, hoping that Hitler would strike east first. Poland categorically refused to allow the Red Army to pass through its territory, even in the event of war with Germany. Negotiations dragged on for months. Only in August, after nearly 4 months, did the British and French military missions arrive in Moscow, and even then without the authority to sign binding agreements. By that time, Germany was already conducting parallel secret talks with the USSR, offering to conclude a non-aggression pact and define spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. For Stalin, this meant postponing the war and gaining time to strengthen defenses, reclaim territories lost after the collapse of the Russian Empire, and prevent German forces from advancing toward Minsk and Kiev in the event of Poland's defeat. The secret protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact fixed the division of interests. The USSR would receive Finland, Estonia, Latvia, the eastern part of Poland, including western Ukraine and western Belarus, as well as Bessarabia. Germany would receive the western part of Poland, along with recognition of its interests in the rest of Central Europe. On August 23, 1939, the Non-Aggression Pact between the USSR and Germany was signed in the Kremlin. A week later, the war began.
Eastern Front, however, the Soviet Union began to reshape the map according to the secret clauses of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In the summer of 1940, Soviet troops occupied the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, effectively annexing them into the USSR. Soon afterward, the Red Army moved into Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, taking territory from Romania. These moves were not merely expansions, they were part of Stalin's strategy to create buffer zones against a potential German strike. But in the far north, Stalin faced a different kind of challenge, one that would become a military embarrassment and embolden Hitler's confidence. Worried that Finland might fall under German influence and alarmed by the proximity of the Finnish border to Leningrad, only about 20 miles away, the Kremlin demanded territorial concessions. The Finns refused, believing that yielding would only invite more demands. On November 30, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded. The Winter War began with overwhelming Soviet numbers, nearly 500,000 troops, thousands of tanks, and air support, against a Finnish force that was vastly outmatched on paper. Yet the Red Army quickly ran into trouble. Finnish soldiers, wearing white camouflage, used skis to move silently through forests, striking supply lines and disappearing before Soviet troops could respond. At the Battle of Suomussalmi, small Finnish units encircled and destroyed entire Soviet divisions using Modi tactics, isolating enemy groups in the snow and starving them into surrender. The early failures exposed deep flaws in the Red Army. Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had eliminated tens of thousands of experienced officers, leaving many units poorly led and badly coordinated. Soviet logistics broke down in the sub-zero temperatures, and troops were sent into combat with inadequate winter gear. By the end of 1939, what was supposed to be a swift operation had turned into a grinding war of attrition, a humiliation for a superpower. But Stalin adapted. Soviet command restructured, brought in fresh troops, and shifted to concentrated artillery bombardments, followed by massed infantry assaults. In February 1940, the Red Army finally broke through the Mannerheim Line, Finland's main defensive network. The Finns, exhausted and out of ammunition, had no choice but to sign the Moscow Peace Treaty in March 1940. They ceded 11% of their territory, including key borderlands near Leningrad. The Soviet Union had technically won, but at a staggering cost. Over 120,000 dead, 3 times the Finnish losses. For Hitler, the lesson was simple. The Red Army was large but incompetent, incapable of resisting a modern, mobile force. The Winter War reinforced his belief that, once France and Britain were dealt with, the Soviet Union could be crushed in a matter of months. Meanwhile, Germany consolidated its hold on Eastern Europe. In April 1940, Hitler turned north, launching Operation Weserbrunning, the invasion of Denmark and Norway. Officially justified as a defensive move to protect neutral countries from Britain, the real objective was strategic control, securing the Norwegian coast to safeguard shipments of Swedish iron ore essential for the German war industry. Denmark capitulated in hours. Norway resisted for 2 months with British and French support, but in the end, the Germans prevailed. The Norwegian campaign had unintended consequences for Britain. Its mishandling led to the resignation of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain in May 1940, opening the door to Winston Churchill, a man who had long warned about the Nazi threat, to take the helm. As spring turned to summer, the stage was set for the next German move. With the Soviet Union tied to Germany by their non-aggression pact, and Western Europe seemingly unprepared for a major war, Hitler was ready to strike west. The rapid campaigns in Norway and Denmark would soon be overshadowed by an even more audacious gamble: the invasion of France and the Low Countries, a move that would bring the Wehrmacht to the very edge of total dominance in Europe.
By the spring of 1941, Nazi Germany stood at the height of its power. In less than 2 years, Hitler had dismantled Poland, crushed France in just 6 weeks, occupied Norway and Denmark, and drawn most of Eastern and Central Europe into his orbit through conquest or alliance. Britain, though defiant under Churchill, was isolated and battered. But for Hitler, Britain was not the ultimate enemy. Since the 1920s, his vision had been fixed on the East. In Mein Kampf and countless speeches, he made it clear the Soviet Union, with its Judeo-Bolshevik government and vast resources, was to be destroyed. The land would be cleared of its people, millions would die, and repopulated with Germans. Its oil, grain, coal, and metals would fuel the Reich's dominance for generations. The Winter War between the USSR and Finland had seemed to confirm Nazi beliefs that the Red Army was poorly led, inflexible, and incapable of modern mobile warfare. Combined with Stalin's purges of the officer corps and the chaos of Soviet industrial reorganization, Hitler was convinced victory would come quickly. So the Wehrmacht prepared for Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. The plan called for 3 massive army groups to advance simultaneously. Army Group North would sweep through the Baltics and take Leningrad. Army Group Center would drive straight for Moscow, the political and administrative heart of the USSR. And Army Group South would seize Ukraine, its grain harvests, and the vital oil fields beyond. The scale was staggering. Over 3 million German troops, supported by 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 2,800 aircraft. Alongside them marched over 600,000 soldiers from Germany's allies, Finland, Romania, Hungary, Italy, and Slovakia. Never before had such a force been assembled for a single operation. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, without a declaration of war, the skies over the Soviet frontier erupted. The Luftwaffe struck hundreds of airfields, destroying much of the Soviet Air Force on the ground. On land, armored spearheads punched through Soviet defenses, encircling entire armies. In the opening weeks, the advance was breathtaking. In the north, German forces swept through Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. In the center, Minsk fell in a week, Smolensk soon after. In the south, after brutal fighting, the encirclement at Kiev in September netted over 600,000 Soviet prisoners in a single operation, the largest in military history. By October, German forces had captured more than 2.5 million Soviet troops in total. By any conventional measure, the Soviet Union should have collapsed, yet it did not. Stalin ordered the evacuation of hundreds of factories from threatened areas. Entire industrial plants were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and shipped east to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. There, workers, many of them women, teenagers, and the elderly, rebuilt the machinery and restarted production in weeks. Hitler, meanwhile, made a critical strategic mistake. After the victories of summer, instead of pushing Army Group Center directly toward Moscow, he diverted much of its strength south to help secure Ukraine. The move delayed the Moscow offensive by precious months, giving the Red Army time to reorganize. When the Germans resumed their drive for Moscow in October, Operation Typhoon, the weather turned. The autumn rains transformed roads into seas of mud, halting tanks and supply trucks. As soon as the mud froze, winter struck with full force. The coldest temperatures in decades descended. German troops, still in thin summer uniforms, froze in the trenches. Engines wouldn't start, lubricants solidified, weapons jammed. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army counterattacked. Fresh divisions from Siberia, released after Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan would not strike in the Far East, smashed into the exhausted Wehrmacht along a broad front. These troops were trained for winter war, in white camouflage, on skis, and equipped with weapons that worked in the cold. The German advance collapsed. In some sectors, they were driven back over 100 miles. For the first time in the war, Hitler's armies had suffered a major defeat. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was broken. The cost for the USSR was staggering. Millions of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, and vast swaths of territory lost. But the strategic reality was now clear. The Soviet Union had withstood the most powerful military assault ever launched, alone, while Britain was still recovering from the Blitz, and the United States had not yet entered the war. From this moment forward, Germany faced the war it had never wanted, a prolonged two-front conflict against an enemy that could not be broken quickly. For the Soviet Union, the battle for survival had only just begun, and in the years ahead, it would become the central theater of the entire Second World War.
The German advance in 1942 had one overriding goal: oil. Without it, the Wehrmacht's tanks, planes, and trucks could not fight. The fields of the Caucasus, centered around Baku in Soviet Azerbaijan, were the prize. Capturing them would cripple the Soviet war effort and secure Germany's fuel supply for years. Hitler's plan for 1942, Case Blue, split Army Group South into two massive thrusts. One, Army Group A, would drive deep into the Caucasus toward the oil fields. The other, Army Group B, would strike at the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River, severing Soviet transport links and anchoring the northern flank of the southern offensive. The name Stalingrad carried symbolic weight. For Hitler, taking the city named after his enemy would be a propaganda coup. For Stalin, losing it was unthinkable. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed a bombing campaign that turned much of Stalingrad into rubble. The destruction only made defense easier. The shattered landscape provided cover for Soviet soldiers who fought block by block, room by room, often at ranges where tanks and artillery were useless. By September, German forces had pushed to the Volga's edge. They controlled most of the city, but the Soviets clung to narrow strips of land along the river, supplied at night by small boats dodging artillery fire.
Every day brought ferocious assaults. Streets changed hands multiple times in a single afternoon. Soviet sniper teams, like the now legendary Vasily Zaitsev, hunted German officers in the ruins, turning the city into a killing ground. Then, on November 19, 1942, the Soviets struck back. Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment, targeted the flanks of the German Sixth Army, flanks held not by German troops but by under-equipped Romanian forces. In just 4 days, the pincers met at the town of Kalach, trapping over 250,000 Axis soldiers inside Stalingrad. Hitler forbade any retreat. He promised that the trapped forces would be resupplied by air. The Luftwaffe tried, but the airlift delivered only a fraction of the daily needs. Food and ammunition ran out. Winter closed in. Soviet artillery pounded the pocket relentlessly. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. Of the 250,000 troops encircled, only about 91,000 went into captivity, and fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the image of Nazi invincibility and marked the first time a full German army had been destroyed in the field. While the world focused on Stalingrad, the Soviets had also blunted the German push into the Caucasus. By early 1943, Army Group A was in full retreat, abandoning any hope of seizing Baku's oil. In one campaign, Germany's strategic aims in the east had collapsed. But Hitler refused to accept the strategic shift. In the summer of 1943, he launched Operation Citadel, the last great German offensive on the Eastern Front, aimed at a massive Soviet bulge near Kursk. The Germans assembled thousands of tanks, including the new Tiger and Panther models, hoping to deliver a knockout blow. The Soviets knew it was coming. Months of intelligence gathering and preparation had turned the Kursk salient into a fortress. Deep minefields, layers of anti-tank guns, and interlocking defensive lines stretched for hundreds of miles. When the Germans attacked in July, they met a wall of steel. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history. On the southern face of the salient at Prokhorovka, waves of Soviet and German armor clashed in close quarters, often so near that tanks rammed each other. By mid-July, the German offensive stalled. A Soviet counteroffensive drove them back, seizing the initiative for good. From this point onward, the Red Army never again ceded the strategic initiative. The Wehrmacht, bled dry by Stalingrad and Kursk, could no longer launch a major offensive in the east. It's here that the scale of the Soviet role becomes undeniable. In 1942 and 1943, while the U.S. and Britain were fighting in North Africa and preparing for the invasion of Italy, the Eastern Front absorbed and destroyed the bulk of Germany's military strength. At Stalingrad, Kursk, and across the endless front lines from the Black Sea to the Arctic, the Red Army was grinding down Hitler's war machine in a way no other Allied force could. The cost was staggering. By the end of 1943, Soviet military deaths had already exceeded 7 million, with millions more civilians dead from occupation, starvation, and mass executions. But the tide had turned. The Red Army was now on the offensive, and it would not stop until Berlin itself fell. By the start of 1944, the strategic balance of the Second World War had fundamentally shifted. The Wehrmacht, once the unstoppable spearhead of Nazi expansion, was now fighting defensively along a front that stretched thousands of miles. In the east, the Soviet Union had seized the initiative after the twin disasters for Germany at Stalingrad and Kursk. From this point on, the Red Army's campaigns would not merely repel the invader, they would dismantle the Nazi Empire piece by piece. The winter of 1943–44 saw the Soviets press forward on multiple fronts. In January 1944, after 872 days, the siege of Leningrad was finally broken. The longest and most brutal siege in modern history had starved the city, killing over 1 million civilians, yet it never fell. Its relief was both a strategic and symbolic victory, restoring a major port and freeing Soviet forces to push into the Baltic states. In the south, the Soviets launched a massive offensive in Ukraine. The Dnieper River, which German planners had hoped to use as a natural defensive barrier, Pathians, Soviet troops controlled a line just 40 miles from the German capital. The Third Reich was surrounded, its armies bled dry, its industry bombed into ruin. In the west, Allied forces had crossed into Germany, but it was clear to anyone studying the maps, the road to Berlin lay open before the Soviets. The final chapter of the war in Europe was about to be written, and it would be written largely in the East.
By early 1945, Nazi Germany was cornered. From the west, American, British, Canadian, and French forces had crossed the Rhine. From the east, the Red Army stood on the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. Between them, the once mighty Wehrmacht was a shadow of itself, starved of fuel, short of ammunition, and holding a front with barely trained recruits and aging veterans. For Stalin, the final push was both military and political. The Western Allies were advancing rapidly, but Soviet troops were far closer to Berlin. Control of the German capital would mean control over the post-war political order in Central and Eastern Europe. The last great Soviet operation of the war, the Battle of Berlin, was designed to end the conflict quickly and decisively. On April 16, 1945, the Red Army launched the Berlin Offensive with one of the largest artillery bombardments in history. Over 40,000 guns, mortars, and rocket launchers unleashed a thunderous barrage along the Oder-Neisse line. Entire sections of forest were flattened, towns reduced to rubble in minutes. Under the cover of this storm, Soviet forces surged forward. Facing them were some of Germany's last reserves, Wehrmacht units mixed with Waffen-SS formations, Hitler Youth teenagers, and Volkssturm, civilians armed with rifles or even Panzerfausts. Many had no real training. Still, the fighting was vicious. In the Seelow Heights, east of Berlin, German defenses held up the Soviet advance for several days in bloody close-quarters combat. But the weight of men and materiel was overwhelming. By April 19th, the German lines collapsed and the road to Berlin lay open. 3 Soviet fronts, the first Belarusian under Zhukov, the first Ukrainian under Konev, and the second Belarusian under Rakowski, converged on the city. As the encirclement tightened, Hitler remained in his underground Führer bunker, issuing orders to phantom armies that no longer existed. The battle for Berlin itself was urban warfare at its most brutal. Soviet troops fought from building to building, using tanks as mobile artillery to blast German positions at point-blank range. Resistance was fanatical in places, but hopeless. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire, and the city descended into chaos. Fires, collapsing buildings, and constant bombardment. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. The last defenders of the city surrendered to the Red Army on May 2nd. In the following days, German forces across Europe laid down their arms. The official act of unconditional surrender was signed on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The statistics tell the scale of the Soviet role in that victory. Of roughly 13 million German soldiers who served on all fronts during the war, over 10 million fought on the Eastern Front. Of those, the vast majority were killed, wounded, or captured there. The Red Army destroyed over 75% of all German divisions engaged in the war. For the United States and Britain, victory in Europe was shared, but the price was not equal. While Western Allied forces suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, the Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people, soldiers and civilians combined. Entire cities had been erased, and vast regions lay in ruins. Yet it was this unmatched sacrifice, fought on the largest and bloodiest front in human history, that broke the back of Nazi Germany. The post-war world was shaped as much by this military reality as by diplomacy. The Red Army's presence in Eastern and Central Europe ensured Soviet influence over the region, setting the stage for the Cold War. For decades, the story of the Eastern Front would be overshadowed in the West by narratives of D-Day and the liberation of France. But the truth remains, without the Soviet Union's relentless, crushing campaign from Moscow to Berlin, Hitler's regime might have endured far longer, and the cost of ending it could have been far greater.
In the end, the banners that fluttered over the ruins of Berlin in May 1945 told a truth far more complex than the slogans printed in history books. Red banners, carried by soldiers who had marched thousands of miles through fire, snow, and mud, marked the Reichstag. They belonged to the Red Army, not to Hollywood war heroes or the neat, sanitized victories celebrated in the West. Yes, the United States supplied vital resources through Lend-Lease, trucks, planes, food, raw materials. Yes, the British fought with courage in the skies over London and in the sands of North Africa. But on the Eastern Front, the war was not a cinematic backdrop. It was the war. While D-Day is taught as the turning point, the Germans had already suffered their mortal wounds years earlier at Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk, battles fought hundreds of miles from Normandy, in a climate and on a scale unimaginable to most Americans. The Wehrmacht bled out in the East. 4 out of every 4 German soldiers killed in World War II died fighting the Soviets. This is not an opinion, it is arithmetic. The Soviet Union bore an unimaginable cost, over 27 million dead, soldiers and civilians, entire cities erased, entire generations scarred. In the West, the images of the war often end with cheering crowds in Paris or Times Square. In the East, the war ended with mothers searching rubble for the bodies of their children. If the USSR had collapsed in 1941, as Hitler expected, there would have been no safe Britain to launch D-Day from, no American foothold in Europe, no victory parades. The entire continent could have been locked in a Nazi empire from the English Channel to the Ural Mountains. But the USSR did not collapse. It absorbed the first blows, fought the largest battles in human history, pushed the Wehrmacht back mile by mile, and smashed its heart in Berlin. That is not to diminish the courage of Allied soldiers in the West, but to correct a historical imbalance. For decades, geopolitical rivalries of the Cold War allowed one truth to be quietly buried under layers of selective memory. Without the Soviet Union's resistance, sacrifice, and ultimate offensive, Nazi Germany would not have been defeated when it was, if at all. This is the part of the story rarely told in American classrooms, not because it is inconvenient, but because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the victory over Hitler was, above all, a Soviet victory, paid for in blood on an unimaginable scale. And perhaps that is why, 80 years later, the red flag over the Reichstag remains one of the most powerful photographs in history. It is the image of a truth too large to be forgotten, no matter how the narrative is written.